The sun had long set over the city of Westbrook. Street lamps cast yellow pools of light on the empty sidewalks. Most businesses had closed hours ago, but in one building, light still glowed from the second-floor windows. This was Harmony Studios, owned by Keith Douglas, one of the most successful music producers in the country. Keith sat at the mixing board, his fingers moving across sliders and knobs with practiced ease. At 42, he had produced albums for some of the biggest names in the music industry. His 5 Grammy Awards stood in a neat row on a shelf behind him. Tonight, he was putting the finishing touches on what he believed might be his best work. Yet, "I think we've got it," Keith said, pushing back from the desk and stretching his arms above his head. His shoulders ached from hunching over the equipment for the past 6 hours. "Let's call it a night." The 2 young sound engineers nodded in agreement. Amber White, a talented 26-year-old with bright blue hair, began shutting down the equipment. Joey Garcia, 24 and fresh out of audio engineering school, stifled a yawn as he organized the notes they had taken during the session. "You two head out," Keith said. "I'll lock up. Just need to make a few notes while everything's fresh in my mind." "You sure, boss?" Joey asked, already reaching for his jacket. "Positive. Go get some sleep. We start early tomorrow." Amber and Joey gathered their things and headed for the door. Keith could hear their voices fade as they walked down the hallway to the back exit. He turned back to the computer, typing out some thoughts about the final mix. He wanted to adjust the bass on track 3 and maybe bring up the vocals on the bridge of track 7. Small changes, but important ones. 20 minutes later, Keith finally shut down the computer. It was just past midnight. He grabbed his leather jacket from the back of his chair and his car keys from the desk. The studio was quiet now, with only the soft hum of the air conditioning. Keith loved this time of night when the world seemed to pause, giving him space to think. He walked through the darkened hallways, flicking off lights as he went. At the back exit, he punched in the security code, setting the alarm for the night. The door closed behind him with a heavy click. The small parking lot behind the studio held only his car now, a black SUV that his wife had insisted he buy after his last album went triple platinum. Keith took a deep breath of the cool night air. The sky was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. He walked to his car, keys jingling in his hand. As he reached for the door handle, bright headlights suddenly flooded the parking lot, blinding him momentarily. Keith raised his hand to shield his eyes, trying to see who had pulled in. A police cruiser had entered the lot, its headlights aimed directly at him. Keith lowered his hand and waited, assuming the officer was just checking the lot during a routine patrol. Instead, the driver's door of the police car swung open and a uniformed officer stepped out with his gun drawn. "Hands where I can see them," the officer shouted. Keith's body tensed, but he raised his hand slowly, making sure his movements were clear and deliberate. The officer approached, his weapon pointed directly at Keith's chest. In the harsh glare of the headlights, Keith could make out the name on the officer's badge. "Miller." "Officer, this is my studio," Keith said, keeping his voice calm and steady, despite the fear building inside him. "I own this building." Officer Frank Miller continued forward, his gun unwavering. He was a stocky man in his mid-40s with short-cropped gray hair and deep lines around his mouth that suggested he frowned more than he smiled. His eyes, narrowed and suspicious, scanned Keith from head to toe. "Sure you do," Miller said, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "ID now." Keith nodded slowly. "My wallet is in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for it very slowly, okay?" Miller didn't respond, but his grip on the gun tightened visibly. Keith moved his right hand, inch by inch, toward his back pocket. His heart pounded so hard he was sure the officer could hear it. As his fingers touched his wallet, Miller barked another order. "Faster! Stop stalling!" Keith flinched at the sudden shout but continued his careful movement. He pulled out his wallet and held it out in front of him. Miller snatched it with his free hand, still keeping the gun trained on Keith. "Keith Douglas," Miller read from the driver's license, glancing between the ID and Keith's face. "Says here you live in Hillcrest. What are you doing in this neighborhood? At midnight?" "Like I said, this is my recording studio," Keith explained, pointing toward the building with his still raised left hand. "Harmony Studios. My name is on the sign out front. I stayed late working on a project. Miller's expression didn't change. Lots of break-ins in this area lately, mostly drug addicts looking for electronics they can sell. Keith felt a surge of anger but pushed it down. Getting upset would only make the situation worse. Officer, you can check my ID against the business license. It's registered in my name. Or I can show you my keys to the building. Or the security code. Whatever you need. Miller ignored the offer. What's in the car? Any weapons or drugs I should know about? No, sir, no weapons, no drugs, just my laptop and some work files. The standoff continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Keith's arms were beginning to ache from being held up, but he didn't dare lower them. His mind raced, trying to understand why this was happening. He had done nothing wrong. He was simply leaving his own business. Yet here he was, with a gun pointed at his chest, being treated like a criminal. A movement near the back door of the studio caught Keith's attention. Amber and Joey stood there, their faces shocked, as they took in the scene. Keith realized they must have lingered in the parking lot longer than he thought, maybe talking or checking their phones before leaving. Amber had her phone out, pointed at Keith and Officer Miller. She was recording. Joey had his phone to his ear, his lips moving quickly as he spoke to someone. Keith felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief that there were witnesses, that whatever happened next wouldn't be just his word against the officers. Fear, because he didn't want his young employees to get caught up in this dangerous situation. Officer, those are my employees, Keith said, nodding toward Amber and Joey. They work for me at the studio. They can confirm who I am. Miller glanced over his shoulder, noticing the two young people for the first time. His jaw tightened when he saw Amber recording. He turned back to Keith, his expression even more hostile than before. Tell them to stop recording and mind their own business, Miller demanded. They're just worried about me, Keith said. Please, this is all a misunderstanding. Check my ID again. Google me if you need to. I'm not a threat. Miller's radio crackled to life. A woman's voice came through asking for his location and status. Miller hesitated, then responded without lowering his weapon. Miller here, checking a suspicious person at 1420 Maple Street. Possible burglary in progress. Situation under control. Keith closed his eyes briefly, trying to remain calm. This was far from under control, and he wasn't a suspicious person or a burglar. He was a business owner standing outside his own building, but arguing would only escalate things. In the distance, Keith heard the wail of another police siren getting closer. He didn't know if that was good news or bad news. Would the arriving officer be like Miller, ready to assume the worst? Or would they bring reason to this increasingly tense situation? All Keith could do was stand there, hands raised, and wait. Wait and hope that someone would listen before things went terribly wrong. The wail of the siren grew louder as another police car pulled into the parking lot. Keith remained frozen in place, his hands still raised, as Officer Miller kept his gun pointed at him. The second police car parked at an angle, its headlights adding to the harsh glare in the small lot. A woman stepped out of the vehicle. She wore the same uniform as Miller, but with sergeant stripes on her sleeve. She was tall, with short brown hair tucked neatly under her cap. Her movements were quick but calm as she assessed the situation. Miller, what's going on here? She called out, walking toward them with her hand resting on her holstered weapon. Suspicious individual, Sergeant Powell, Miller replied without taking his eyes off Keith. Found him lurking around this building. Sergeant Diane Powell looked from Miller to Keith, then to Amber and Joey, who still stood by the back door of the studio. Amber continued recording while Joey spoke urgently into his phone. I wasn't lurking, Keith said, addressing the sergeant directly. This is my recording studio. I was working late and was just leaving when Officer Miller pulled in. Powell's expression remained neutral, but her eyes narrowed slightly. You have identification, sir? Officer Miller has my wallet, Keith explained. My name is Keith Douglas. I own Harmony Studios. It's a legitimate business registered with the city. Powell turned to Miller. Let me see his ID. Miller hesitated before handing over Keith's wallet, never lowering his weapon. Powell examined the driver's license, then looked back at Keith. Mr. Douglas, do you have any way to verify your connection to this building? Yes, Keith said, relief washing over him at her reasonable tone. The business license is inside in my office. My name is on the sign out front. And those two by the door are my employees. They can confirm who I am. Powell nodded. Officer, Miller, lower your weapon. But Sergeant, Miller began. Lower your weapon, officer, Powell repeated, her voice firmer this time. Now. Miller's jaw tightened, but he slowly lowered his gun, though he didn't holster it. Powell handed Keith's wallet back to him. You can put your hands down, Mr. Douglas, she said. I apologize for this misunderstanding. Keith lowered his arms gratefully, his shoulders aching from the prolonged position. He took his wallet and slipped it back into his pocket, watching Miller cautiously. Those two recording over there, Powell said, nodding toward Amber and Joey. They work for you? Yes, Keith confirmed. Amber White and Joey Garcia. They're sound engineers. We're all working late on a project, Powell called out to them. Ms. White, Mr. Garcia, can you come over here, please? And Ms. White, you can keep recording if you want to. Amber and Joey exchanged a glance before walking cautiously toward the small group. Joey had ended his call but kept his phone in his hand. Amber's phone remained raised, still capturing everything. Do you both work for Mr. Douglas? Powell asked when they reached her. Yes, Amber said firmly. Keith is our boss. He owns Harmony Studios. And we were all working late tonight, Joey added. Keith stayed behind to lock up while we came out to our cars. Powell nodded. Thank you. She turned back to Keith. Mr. Douglas, can you tell me exactly what happened here? Keith took a deep breath. I was leaving the studio after finishing work. I had just reached my car when Officer Miller pulled in with his lights on. He immediately got out with his gun drawn and ordered me to put my hands up. I explained that this was my studio, but he didn't believe me. He demanded my ID, which I gave him, but he continued to hold me at gunpoint. Throughout Keith's explanation, Miller's face grew increasingly flushed. His grip on his gun tightened even though it was pointed at the ground. That's not what happened, Miller interrupted. I saw a suspicious individual in a closed business parking lot after midnight. I followed proper protocol for a potential burglary situation. By immediately drawing your weapon? Powell questioned. Before any attempt at verbal contact or identification? This is a high crime area, Miller insisted. And he was, This is not a high crime area, Officer Miller. Powell cut him off, and Mr. Douglas was simply standing by his vehicle. Miller's face darkened. You weren't here, Sergeant. You didn't see how he was acting. I have it all on video. Amber spoke up, her voice steady despite the tension. From the moment Officer Miller pulled in, Mr. Douglas did nothing threatening. He kept his hands visible the entire time. Miller turned toward Amber, his expression openly hostile now. Civilians don't understand police work. We have to make split-second decisions. That's enough, Officer Miller, Powell said sharply. She turned to Keith. Mr. Douglas, I apologize. Again for this incident, are you all right? Keith nodded slowly. Yes, but I'd like to understand why this happened. I was just leaving my own business. Powell's expression softened slightly. A fair question. Officer Miller, please wait by your vehicle. Miller opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again. He holstered his weapon and walked back to his patrol car, his posture stiff, with anger. Once Miller was out of earshot, Powell lowered her voice. Mr. Douglas, I want to be clear. What happened here tonight was not proper procedure. Officer Miller had no justification for approaching you with his weapon drawn based solely on your presence in this parking lot. Then why did he? Keith asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Powell met his gaze directly. That's something I intend to find out. This isn't the first incident involving Officer Miller. Keith nodded, understanding what she wasn't explicitly saying. This wasn't about protocol or misunderstandings. This was about something much deeper and more troubling. What happens now? Joey asked, speaking up for the first time since joining the conversation. Now, Powell said, I need statements from all of you. Then, Mr. Douglas, you're free to go home. I'll be filing a full report about tonight's events." "And Officer Miller?" Amber asked, her phone still recording. "That will be handled internally," Powell replied, though her expression suggested she wasn't pleased with Miller's actions. Keith looked over at Miller, who stood by his patrol car, arms crossed over his chest. Even from a distance, the anger in his posture was evident. Keith thought about all the stories he'd heard from friends, from family members, about encounters with police that went wrong. He'd been lucky tonight. Sergeant Powell had arrived quickly. Amber had been recording. Joey had called 911. But what if none of that had happened? "I want to file a formal complaint," Keith said, turning back to Powell. "Not against the department, but specifically against Officer Miller. His actions tonight were unprofessional and dangerous." Powell nodded. "That's your right, Mr. Douglas. I can give you the information on how to do that." "I have a better idea," Keith said. "I have some connections at City Hall. Tomorrow I'm going to call the mayor and the police chief directly. This isn't just about what happened to me tonight, it's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Powell didn't look surprised. "I understand. For now, let's get your statement so you can all go home. It's been a long night." As Powell led them toward her patrol car to take their official statements, Keith glanced back at Miller one more time. The officer was on his phone now, speaking to someone with animated gestures. Keith wondered who he was calling so late at night, and what he was saying about what had just happened. One thing was certain, this incident wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, Keith sat in his home office, phone in hand. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Officer Miller's gun pointed at his chest. The fear and anger from the night before had not faded. If anything, they had grown stronger with the light of day. His wife, Linda, placed a cup of coffee on the desk beside him. She was still wearing her pajamas, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. The worry lines around her eyes had deepened since he had told her. "What happened?" "Are you sure about this?" she asked, resting her hand on his shoulder. "Once you make these calls, there's no going back." Keith covered her hand with his. "I'm sure. If I don't speak up, nothing will change. And next time it might be someone who doesn't have the connections I do." Linda nodded. She understood. As a black man who had achieved success in the music industry, Keith had platforms and resources that many others in similar situations did not. He had a responsibility to use them. "I'll be in the kitchen," she said, squeezing his shoulder gently, before leaving the room. Keith took a deep breath and dialed the first number on his list. He had known Mayor Paul Bennett for years. They had met at numerous charity events, and Keith had even produced a campaign ad for him during the last election. The mayor answered on the third ring. "Keith, good to hear from you. How's the music business?" "Not calling about music today, Paul," Keith said, his voice serious. "Something happened last night that you need to know about." Keith explained the incident in detail, from Miller drawing his gun without provocation to Sergeant Powell's intervention. The mayor listened without interrupting, though Keith could hear his sharp intake of breath at several points in the story. "This is deeply concerning," Mayor Bennett said when Keith finished. "Officer Miller had no cause to approach you that way. I'll speak to Chief Ramirez immediately. In fact, I'd like you to come to City Hall today if possible. The chief needs to hear this directly from you." Keith agreed to a meeting at noon. As soon as he hung up, his phone rang. It was Joey. "Boss, have you seen it?" Joey asked without preamble. "Seen what?" "Amber's video. She posted it online last night after we left the police station. It's everywhere." Keith quickly opened his laptop and searched for the video. It appeared immediately, already with hundreds of thousands of views. Comments were pouring in beneath it, expressing outrage and calling for Officer Miller to be fired. As Keith watched the footage, he felt a chill run down his spine. The video captured everything. Miller approaching with his gun drawn. Keith explaining that he owned the studio. Miller's dismissive response. The angle wasn't perfect, but the audio was clear. There was no question about what had happened. Keith's phone rang again. This time it was his publicist, Samantha. "I've had calls from every major news outlet in the country," she said. "They all want statements or interviews. How do you want to handle this?" Keith thought for a moment. Set up a press conference for this afternoon, after my meeting at City Hall. No individual interviews yet. Next was a call from his lawyer, Alan Green. I've reviewed the video, Keith. We have a strong case for a civil rights violation. Do you want to pursue legal action? Yes, Keith said without hesitation. This isn't just about me, Alan. It's about holding the department accountable. By the time Keith arrived at City Hall, the story had grown even bigger. News vans lined the street outside, and reporters called out to him as he made his way up the steps. He didn't stop to answer questions, focusing instead on reaching the mayor's office. Inside, Mayor Bennett waited with Police Chief Elena Ramirez. The chief was a stern-looking woman in her 50s with salt-and-pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She shook Keith's hand firmly. "Mr. Douglas, I want to start by apologizing for Officer Miller's actions," she said. "I've reviewed the video and Sergeant Powell's report. What happened to you was unacceptable." Keith appreciated her directness. "Thank you, Chief Ramirez, but I'm not here for apologies. I'm here because I want to know what you're going to do about it." Chief Ramirez nodded. "Officer Miller has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. However, given the clear evidence from the video and witness statements, I've already begun the process for his termination." Keith was surprised. He had expected resistance, bureaucratic delays, talk of internal reviews that would drag on for months. "You're firing him? Just like that?" "Just like that," Chief Ramirez confirmed. "The evidence is overwhelming. His actions violated department policy on multiple levels. More importantly, they violated the trust of the community we serve. We can't have officers who behave that way wearing our badge." Mayor Bennett leaned forward. "Keith, Chief Ramirez has my full support on this. What happened to you should never happen to anyone. We're taking immediate action to make sure Officer Miller is held accountable." Keith studied both of their faces, looking for any sign that they were just telling him what he wanted to hear. He saw none. "I appreciate that. But this isn't just about one officer. This is about a system that allowed someone like Miller to carry a badge and gun in the first place." Chief Ramirez sighed. "You're right. Miller has had complaints before. Nothing this serious, but enough that we should have recognized the pattern. That's on me, and I take full responsibility. We're announcing a review of police procedures and training," Mayor Bennett added, "and we're forming a civilian oversight committee to provide more community involvement in police matters." Keith nodded slowly. It was a start. But he had been in enough business negotiations to know that initial offers were rarely the best possible outcome. "I want to be part of that committee," he said, "and I want Sergeant Powell involved in the KO training reforms. She did her job properly last night. Others should follow her example." Chief Ramirez and Mayor Bennett exchanged glances before the mayor spoke. "I think those are reasonable requests. We'll make it happen." The meeting continued for another hour as they discussed details. By the time Keith left City Hall, he had secured commitments for significant changes in the police department's training, oversight, and accountability processes. Outside, the crowd of reporters had grown. Keith stepped up to the hastily arranged podium, Samantha at his side. Camera flashes lit up the steps of City Hall as he began to speak. "Last night, I was confronted by an armed police officer while leaving my own business," Keith said, his voice steady and clear. "I did nothing wrong. I posed no threat. Yet I found myself looking down the barrel of a gun, fearing for my life." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "What happened to me happens to people who look like me every day across this country. The difference is that I have resources and connections that many others don't. I have a platform that allows my voice to be heard." Keith continued, explaining the outcome of his meeting with the mayor and police chief. He announced Officer Miller's imminent termination and the planned reforms. He also announced his intention to pursue legal action. "This isn't about money," he clarified. "Any settlement will go toward programs that build better relationships between police and the communities they serve. This is about accountability and change." As Keith finished speaking, the crowd of reporters erupted with questions. But before he could answer any of them, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sergeant Powell. "Just saw your press conference. Thank you for what you said about me. I'd like to talk when you have time." There's more to the story of Officer Miller that you should know. Keith slipped the phone back into his pocket. The story wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning to unfold. Keith met Sergeant Powell at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the police station. It was mid-afternoon, but the place was nearly empty. Powell was already there when Keith arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee. She was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a simple blue sweater, but her straight posture and alert eyes still marked her as a police officer. "Thank you for meeting me," Powell said as Keith sat down across from her. "I wasn't sure you would want to." Keith accepted the coffee she pushed toward him. "Your text made me curious. You said there was more to know about Officer Miller." Wool nodded, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. "Miller has been with the department for 12 years. In that time, there have been 7 formal complaints filed against him, 3 for excessive force, 2 for racial profiling, and 2 for general misconduct." Keith leaned forward. 7 complaints, and he was still on the force? "Yes," Powell said, her voice tight with frustration. "The system protected him. Each complaint was investigated internally. Each time, the evidence was deemed inconclusive, or the incident was attributed to proper procedure under difficult circumstances." "But you knew," Keith said. It wasn't a question. Powell looked down at her coffee. "I've worked with Miller for 5 years. I've seen how he treats people, especially people of color. I've reported my concerns to superiors multiple times. Each time I was told that without clear evidence of misconduct, nothing could be done. And now there is clear evidence," Keith said. "Yes. Amber's video changed everything. There's no way to explain away what Miller did to you. It's all there on camera, unprovoked, unjustified, and clearly motivated by bias." Keith took a sip of his coffee, considering her words. "Why are you telling me all this? Couldn't this hurt your career?" Powell met his gaze directly. "Because the department needs to change, not just by firing one bad officer, but by addressing the culture that protected him for so long, and because I believe you can help make that happen." She pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the table. "These are copies of all the complaints against Miller, along with notes on how each investigation was handled. I'm not supposed to have these, much less share them with you, but your lawyer should see them." Keith looked at the folder but didn't touch it. "You could lose your job over this." "Maybe," Powell admitted. "But I became a police officer to protect people, not to protect other officers who abuse their power. If helping you bring about real change costs me my job, I can live with that." Keith respected her courage. He reached out and took the folder. "I'll make sure this information is used responsibly, and I'll do what I can to protect you as a source." Powell nodded gratefully. She seemed about to say more when her phone rang. She checked the screen and frowned. "I need to take this," she said, standing up and walking a few steps away. Keith watched as she listened to the caller, her expression growing more concerned with each passing second. When she returned to the table, her face was grim. "Miller just gave an interview to Channel 6 News," she said. "He's claiming he's being made a scapegoat, says he followed proper procedure, and is being sacrificed to appease the liberal media and the anti-police movement." Keith wasn't surprised. He's trying to control the narrative. "It gets worse," Powell continued. "He specifically named me, claiming I have a personal vendetta against him because he reported me for procedural violations last year. Is that true?" Keith asked. Powell shook her head. "He did file a complaint against me, but it was after I reported his excessive use of force against a teenage boy. His complaint was dismissed. Mine wasn't, but nothing came of it anyway." Keith's phone buzzed with a text from Samantha. "Miller on Channel 6 right now. He's attacking you. Need to respond ASAP." "We both need to go," Keith said, showing Powell the message. "This is about to get ugly." Powell nodded. "Be careful, Keith. Miller has friends in the department. Not everyone agrees with Chief Ramirez's decision to fire him." Keith hurried back to his car and called Samantha while driving to the studio. She had already arranged for a camera crew to meet him there for a response to Miller's claims. By the time Keith arrived, Amber and Joey were also there, along with several other employees who had heard about what happened. "You've seen Miller's interview?" Keith asked Samantha as she ushered him into the main studio where the camera crew was setting up. "Yes. He's painting himself as the victim and you as an entitled celebrity who's using your influence to destroy his career," Samantha explained. "He claims you were belligerent and refused to comply with his orders." "That's a lie," Amber said, angrily. "The video clearly shows Keith cooperating completely." "I know," Samantha said. "But Miller is appealing to people who want to believe his version. We need to respond quickly but carefully." While the camera crew finished setting up, Keith reviewed the talking points Samantha had prepared. He would stick to the facts, refer to the video evidence, and avoid making personal attacks against Miller, no matter how tempting it might be. Just before they went live, Alan called. "Keith, I've just reviewed the document Sergeant Powell gave you. This changes our legal strategy. Miller isn't just a rogue officer. He's a symptom of systemic problems in the department. We need to expand our lawsuit to include the department's failure to discipline him despite numerous complaints." "Do it," Keith said. "This isn't just about me anymore." The interview went smoothly. Keith remained calm and factual, referring repeatedly to the video evidence and expressing gratitude for the support he had received from Chief Ramirez and Mayor Bennett. He didn't mention Powell or the documents she had provided. When the interviewer asked if Keith was pursuing legal action, he replied carefully, "Yes, but this isn't about seeking money. It's about accountability and ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to others who might not have the resources or platform that I do." After the camera crew left, Keith gathered his employees in the studio's lounge area. "I want to thank all of you for your support," he said, "especially Amber and Joey, who were there that night. Your quick thinking in recording the incident and calling 911 made all the difference." Amber smiled. "We had your back, boss, always will." "This situation is going to get more attention in the coming days," Keith continued. "Some of it might affect the studio and our work. I want you all to know that I'll do everything I can to protect you from any negative fallout." Joey spoke up. "We're proud of how you're handling this, Keith. You could have just let it go, used your connections to smooth things over quietly. Instead, you're pushing for real change." Keith nodded, touched by their support. "Change doesn't happen by staying quiet. Sometimes you have to make noise." As the meeting ended and everyone returned to work, Keith checked his phone. There were dozens of messages from friends, colleagues, and even a few celebrities expressing support. But one message stood out. A text from an unknown number. "You should have just gone home and counted yourself lucky. Now you've made enemies. You can't see coming. Back off while you still can." Keith showed the message to Alan, who immediately called Chief Ramirez. Within an hour, tech experts from the police department had traced the message to a burner phone purchased with cash at a convenience store near Officer Miller's apartment. There was no way to prove Miller had sent the message, but the implication was clear. This fight was far from over, and the stakes had just gotten much higher. 1 month had passed since that night in the parking lot. Keith sat in a large meeting room at City Hall. Around the table sat Mayor Bennett, Police Chief Ramirez, 3 city council members, and 5 community leaders. This was the first official meeting of the new Police Oversight Committee. Keith had helped create it. "Let's begin," Mayor Bennett said, looking around the table. "First, I want to thank everyone for agreeing to serve on this committee. Your work will help build a better relationship between our police department and our community." Keith listened as the mayor explained the committee's powers. They would review police policies. They would examine complaints against officers. They would make recommendations for change. Most importantly, they would have real authority, not just empty words. Chief Ramirez spoke next. "The police department is committed to working with this committee. We want to earn back the trust of our community. What happened with Officer Miller showed us that we need better systems to identify and remove problem officers before they cause harm." When it was Keith's turn to speak, he kept his words simple and direct. "I'm here because what happened to me should never happen to anyone. But it does happen every day to people who don't have the resources or platform that I do. This committee is a start toward fixing that." After the meeting, Keith walked with Diane to the parking lot. She was no longer a sergeant. She was now Lieutenant Powell, recently promoted to head the department's new Community Relations and Accountability Division. How does it feel? Keith asked her. Running your own division? Diane smiled. Challenging. But good. Chief Ramirez has given me real support to make changes. We've already revised the use of force policy and improved our complaint process. And the officers? How are they responding? Most are on board, Diane said. They want to do their jobs well. A few are resistant, especially some of Miller's old friends, but they're coming around or finding jobs elsewhere. Keith nodded. And Miller, any word on the criminal charges? The district attorney is still building the case, Diane said. But with the evidence we have, plus his history of complaints, they expect to move forward soon. They reached Diane's car. Before getting in, she turned to Keith. Thank you. For not backing down. For pushing for real change, not just a quick settlement. Thank you for having the courage to speak up, Keith replied. Without those documents you gave me, we might not have gotten this far. Later that day, Keith returned to his studio. Amber and Joey were working with a new artist, a young woman with a powerful voice and meaningful lyrics. Keith watched them through the glass, feeling proud of what they were building together. His phone rang. It was Alan. Good news, his lawyer said. The city has agreed to our settlement terms, $5 million, but more importantly, they've agreed to all the reforms we asked for. Mandatory bias training, body cameras for all officers, an independent review process for complaints, and funding for community programs. That is good news, Keith agreed. What about the part where the money goes to the foundation? Exactly as you wanted, Alan confirmed. The entire settlement will go to the New Douglas Foundation for Justice and Community Relations. None of it goes to you personally. Keith had established the foundation to support young minority artists and provide legal assistance to victims of discrimination and police misconduct. He didn't need the money from the lawsuit. He needed the changes it could create. There's one more thing, Alan added. The settlement includes a non-disclosure agreement about the amount, but not about the reforms. They don't want the dollar figure publicized. That's fine, Keith said. The money was never the point. The changes were always what mattered. After hanging up, Keith walked into the studio control room. Amber looked up from the mixing board and smiled. How did the committee meeting go? Good, Keith said. Really good. We're making progress. Joey spun around in his chair. And the lawsuit? Settled. The city agreed to all our demands for reforms. Amber gave him a high five. That's what I'm talking about. Justice. The young artist in the recording booth looked confused, so Keith briefly explained what had happened a month ago. Her eyes widened as she listened. I remember seeing that video, she said. I didn't realize that was you. My brother had the same thing happen to him last year, but nobody believed him because there was no video. Keith nodded. That's why we're pushing for body cameras for all officers, so there's always a record of what really happened. Do you think it will make a difference? She asked, her voice doubtful. It already has, Keith told her. Miller is gone. New policies are being written. Better training is being implemented. It won't fix everything overnight, but it's a start. That evening, Keith went home early. Linda had prepared a special dinner to celebrate the settlement. Their two teenage children, Zach and Maya, were both home from college for the weekend. Dad, I saw you on the news again, Maya said as they sat down to eat. My professor used your case in our criminal justice class. Keith smiled at his daughter. What did your professor say? That it's a rare example of accountability in a system that often protects its own, Maya replied. And that it only happened because you had the resources and platform to fight back. Keith nodded. That's why the foundation is so important. To help those who don't have those resources. Zach, who was studying business, had a more practical question. So what happens to Miller now, besides losing his job? He's facing criminal charges, Keith explained, and the documents Diane provided showed a pattern of behavior that the department ignored for years. That's led to a broader investigation of the complaint review process. Linda raised her glass. To making a difference. They all clinked glasses, but as they did, Keith's phone buzzed with a news alert. He checked it, and his expression turned serious. "What is it?" Linda asked. "Frank Miller just announced he's running for city council," Keith said, showing them the headline. "He's positioning himself as a victim of cancel culture and anti-police sentiment." The family fell silent for a moment. Then Zach spoke up. "So what are you going to do about it?" Keith thought for a moment. "The same thing I've been doing, speak the truth. Support good candidates who understand the need for accountability. Use the foundation to help people fight injustice." Maya nodded. "The fight isn't over, is it?" "It's never over," Keith said. "Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens step by step, day by day. What happened to me was just one moment in a much longer journey." Later that night, as Keith stood on the back deck looking at the stars, Linda joined him and took his hand. "Are you okay?" she asked. Keith squeezed her hand. "I'm good. When Miller pointed that gun at me, I was terrified. But something good has come from that fear. Real change. Not enough, not yet. But it's a start." "I'm proud of you," Linda said. "You could have just used your connections to make it all go away quietly. Instead, you used your platform to speak up for those who can't." Keith smiled at his wife. "We all have to use the power we have to make things better. Sometimes that means making noise. Sometimes it means shining a light on things people don't want to see." As they stood together in the quiet night, Keith thought about how far they had come in just 1 month. A bad officer removed, new policies created, a committee formed, a foundation established. It wasn't perfect. The fight wasn't over. Miller's bid for city council proved that. But something had changed, and sometimes change was enough to give hope. Hope that the next person wouldn't have to stare down the barrel of a gun for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hope that the system could be better. Hope that justice was possible, and for tonight, hope was enough.